same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Welcome to the Devil in the Details podcast with your host, Will Nesbitt.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Devil in the Details podcast, the podcast where I investigate and expose ongoing, unlawful, non-consensual human experimentation on innocent men and women in the U.S. and possibly abroad. I am one of those people victimized by this atrocity, and now I am working hard to restore justice by sharing evidence and information in hopes of prompting a proper investigation. Join me in my fight and help raise awareness by tuning in and sharing this podcast with your family and friends. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Devil in the Details podcast. I am your host, Will Nesbitt. Today's episode, we have a very special guest today. And I'm going to go ahead and just get into her bio so we can jump right into the interview, because this is something that I've talked about before, and it is something that we definitely need to learn about. Is something that needs to be heard, something that needs to be known as part of American history, especially if you've seen the hype around the recent film Oppenheimer about the building and the testing of the atom bomb. So let's go ahead and get into our guest bio, and we'll jump right in. Elmerine Allen Whitfield Bell is a retired Texas public school teacher. For more than a decade, she has served as an appointed member of the Italy, Texas Economic Development Corporation, the Ellis County Historical Commission, and the Ellis County Women's Building Board of Directors. Additionally, she is a member of the Ellis County Genealogical Society, the Stafford School Alumni Association, and is leader of a group called Save St. Mary Cemetery. An avid genealogist and historian, her goal is to chronicle authentic African American history so that it is preserved for future generations. She is currently curator at the Italy Colored City Hall Museum, a building granted historical designation by the Texas Historical Commission in 2017. She was previously elected and served 2 terms as a member of the Italy, Texas City Council. She is a Christian with active membership at Mount Gilead Missionary Baptist Church. In 1992, after the revelation that her late father, Elmer Allen, was the victim of one of the United States government's sponsored secret medical experiments during the Cold War, Elmerine Allen Whitfield Bell worked tirelessly to give a voice to the 17 victims of the Plutonium project. These men, women, and a 3-year-old child all died without knowing they were duped by scientists from the United States Department of Energy and its predecessors. Elmer Allen, whose left calf was injected with plutonium, was dubbed Cal-3, by the doctors who performed experiments at the University of California Hospital in San Francisco in 1947. 3 days after the plutonium injection, Elmer Allen's left leg was amputated and used in medical research. In 1975, now living in Italy, Texas, Elmer Allen was convinced with deceit from second-generation doctors from the Department of Energy to participate in follow-up studies at the University of Rochester in New York. Elmerine Bell's research has taken her across the United States and Japan since the 1990s, including testimony before a United States Congressional Committee chaired by Senator Philip Sharp of Indiana and Senator Edward Markey of Massachusetts. She also offered testimony to President Clinton's Advisory Committee on Human Experimentation, which gave face and a human touch to the secret atrocities performed and undergirded by funding provided by the government of the United States of America. Now, we actually have a clip of Ms. Bell giving her testimony on January 18th, 1994 at the U.S. Capitol building in D.C. This is before the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Energy and Power. And let's take a look at that clip.
A week ago, I sat on a television talk show panel with other victims and several eminent doctor scientists, and 2 of them are here today, discussing the government's human experimentation projects. The doctor scientist seated to my right told the audience that we should not be upset because my father was injected with plutonium. It was his contention that the scientific community has known about these experiments for decades. These experiments, he declared, were written about in important medical journals. He went on to say that not one piece of data exists in any of these important medical journals that prove that anyone ever died from a plutonium injection. This doctor told the gathered crowd that a vast amount of medical technology has been gained from studying the human plutonium test subjects, and the findings from these studies have been published in these same medical journals for years. He went on to identify several medically known cancer research projects that were successful as a direct result of the human plutonium experiments. He said, Mrs. Whitfield's father should be considered a hero. A hero? Was Elmer Allen a hero to his wife, who had to bear the burden of providing for him and her 2 little children because her husband, an amputee, was unable to continue his railroad porter job? Was he a hero when they had to move the family from Northern California to Central Texas in order to live rent-free in a house that belonged to her mother? Was he a hero when he was unable to keep a job as a shoe repairman because the 45-minute drive into the nearest city could not be continued when in the early 1950s, he began suffering epileptic-type seizures? Was Elmer Allen a hero when often his wife had to sell pop bottles to get a few quarters to purchase gasoline for the automobile in order to get to work? Was he a hero when she had to ask the local grocer to let her pay for the family's food at the end of the month? Was he a hero when there was no fuel oil in the tank to heat the house and she had to borrow and take gifts of money from her parents, brother, aunts, and uncles? Was he a hero when she had to send her children to the hot and dusty cotton fields every summer and fall to earn money to supplement her income? Was he a hero when she had to contend with alcoholic binges and irrational babblings about his so-called illness? Was he a hero when, after sending 2 children to college, she still had little time to devote to her dream of being a writer because she had to wait on him hand and foot? She had to make sure he took his pills, Dilantin, and Thorazine on a timely basis. A hero? Was Elmer Allen a hero to his son, who never had a father with 2 limbs? Was he a hero to this mere child who at the age of 13 felt compelled to climb on another man's tractor and plow another man's field for 10 hours a day to give his mother extra money? Was Elmer Allen a hero to his son when often during the middle of the night he had to help his mother lift his father from the floor to the bed after his father experienced a seizure? Was he a hero to his son who adored him and indulged him, but could not give his father what he needed, the ability to be the man of the house? A hero? Was Elmer Allen a hero to his granddaughter, who could not understand why Granddaddy sat for hours in a chair out in the garage doing nothing? Was he her hero when, determined to give him something meaningful to do, she taught him to master the word search puzzles in the daily newspaper and asked him to make a cage for her pet rabbit? Was he her hero when the only thing he could offer when she went off to college was this piece of advice that she did not understand? He said, "Don't ever let anyone use you as a guinea pig." A hero? Was Elmer Allen my hero when I endured all that my family endured and had the added burden of carrying his name? Was he my hero when I openly and vehemently challenged with disdain his babblings about his so-called illness? Was he my hero when I had to face the open scorn of other family members and the whispers of people in the community who thought my father was crazy? Was he my hero when in my adult life I judged all men as I judged Elmer Allen? Was he my hero when, standing at his deathbed, unable to cry, I only felt relief that my mother would finally get some well-deserved rest? Sirs, Elmer Allen was no hero. And the next time one of America's eminent scientists prepares a paper on plutonium testing in humans for inclusion in one of their prestigious medical journals, I hope they will include this. The Elmer Allen, who was Fredna Hadley Allen's husband, William Thomas Allen Sr.'s father, April, Anita, Deanna, and William Jr.'s grandfather, Cameron and Anna's great-grandfather, and my father, died at 3:30 p.m. on July 18, 1947, in Ward B at the University of California Hospital in San Francisco. The Elmer Allen who died at 6:10 p.m. on June 30th, 1991, in the intensive care unit of Mansfield Community Hospital in Texas, was CAL3, one of America's human nuclear guinea pigs. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a very special guest, Miss Elmerine Allen Whitfield Bell. Miss Bell, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you, Mr. Nesbitt. I appreciate you following through on this issue, and I appreciate your tenacity in carrying it forward. I'm privileged to be here today.
Now, to start, tell us a little bit about you, who you are and what you like to do, and then we'll talk a little bit more about your father.
I'm a retired school teacher. I've been retired about 12 years. I live in South Ellis County, Texas, where I'm a former member of the City Council in Italy, Texas. Currently, I'm curator at the Italy Colored City Hall Museum, which is a state-recognized historical site marked by a plaque from the Texas Historical Commission. And I sometimes substitute teach and dabble in genealogy. That's how I keep myself busy.
Are you originally from Italy, Texas?
I was born in Berkeley, Alameda County, California. But at the age of 6, my parents moved back to my mother's hometown of Italy, Texas. This is where I received my formal education. After graduation, I attended what was then called North Texas State University in Denton, Texas. Shortly after that, I married and moved with my husband's job to the Washington, D.C. area and stayed there for about 12 years before moving back to Dallas.
So your mother and your father moved back to Italy, Texas from California.
Right. After all of this happened to my father.
Okay. All right. And that's what
we didn't know what had happened, but my father's leg was amputated. He could no longer work. Mm-hmm. My mother refused to take welfare from the Contra Costa Social Services Department and moved back so we could have support from her family in order to survive.
You mentioned that your father's leg was amputated. Tell us a little bit more about how that came to be and how he became involved in the experiment in the first place.
Well, my father was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was a Pullman porter. Mm-hmm. And you know the organization.
Yes.
The first unionized group of black men. He had gained employment with the Pullman company around 1940. His first job was a trip on the train from San Francisco to El Paso. But after I was born, he was traveling from San Francisco to Chicago. In 1946, around September of 46, he had an accident. The train jolted and he hit his knee on, I don't know if it was a part of the train or a part of the baggage cart swinging on the train, but he injured his knee. He was on his way out of San Francisco into Chicago. He didn't get any treatment for the knee from a doctor until he got back to San Francisco. I think the runs were 3 to 5 days. But he didn't get any medical treatment until he got back to San Francisco. He worked with the Pullman company doctors for some months. I understand, they did what they could, bandaged it, treated it. It didn't get any better. And then they suspended him put him on leave. And he went to a private doctor, and that doctor treated him until he ran out of money. We're not sure who recommended him to the University of California, San Francisco, but somehow he got into that hospital as a charity patient. And it was at that time that we know now that he was chosen for this experiment.
What happened during the experiment? What did they do to him to cause his leg to be amputated?
The doctors told him, from records that we have, they told him that he had a bone sarcoma. They said in their opinion, the sarcoma was infectious, and it was a serious bone cancer. They performed a biopsy, and from that examination, they pulled out some material and said that it was indeed bone cancer. And they told him his left leg would have to be amputated. Now, it's not clear how these folk who were running the experiment found out about my dad, but Joseph Hamilton, who was an associate of Robert Oppenheimer, learned about my dad, and there were some veteran scientists working in the radiology department at UCSF. They were Robert Stone was one, Earl Miller, and Bertrand Lobier. Bertrand Lobier was actually in the room when they injected the plutonium into my dad's leg, into his calf. So they did not immediately schedule him for surgery. And Ray Mullen was one of Elmer Allen's primary physicians. And he wrote on the medical chart that I'm looking at right now that the amputation would be postponed until Monday. I don't know how far away Monday was, but it said it would be postponed until Monday. In order to have a radioactive tracer substance uptake done. And what that is, what we know now, they were preparing the plutonium. That was the radioactive tracer. It was plutonium. They were having it prepared to inject. And this is the only time on the charts when it says plutonium, when it said that they were preparing the radioactive tracer substance. It has the word plutonium mentioned there in parentheses. So, on July 18th, that was, I believe, that was when they said that they were going to do the amputation, but they didn't do the amputation that day. On July 18th, 1947, Bertram Lobier and several other doctors and one nurse went into the room and gathered around my dad's bed. And according to a lengthy note that was apparently written in Bertrand Lobier's handwriting, Elmer Allen was told the following. I'm going to read from this note. It says, the experimental nature of the intramuscular injection of the radioactive tracer sample was explained to the patient, who agreed to the procedure. The patient was fully oriented and in sane mind. doesn't say what the radioactive material was. And with my dad's limited education, if they had even told him it was plutonium, he wouldn't have known what it was. But he had a cast on his leg at the time. They split down the side of the cast and removed it. But let me backtrack. On this note, a nurse signed the note. After they supposedly read this to my dad, a nurse signed the note. Now, we have evidence that when my dad was taken into the hospital, when he was admitted as a patient, he signed the papers. When they wanted to do a biopsy, he signed the papers. And several other things that happened at UCSF, he signed the papers. But this particular note, he was supposed to be in his sane mind and in the room. Why didn't they ask him to sign that paper? That's why we doubt whether they told him anything. This was written by Bertram Lobier and signed by a nurse. Then they split the cast and injected him with this tracer sample of plutonium. And it says that after that, he was still in a jolly mood, which makes me know that they were joking about everything in the room. And they said he had no pain nor discomfort. Those are also notes that are on this medical chart.
Now you have the actual medical charts that were documented during your father's participation in the experiments. Is that what you're reading to us now? Are you reading from the actual documentation?
Well, when the Albuquerque Tribune, that was a Freedom of Information Act request filed by the Albuquerque Tribune newspaper in order for us to get these records. And then when the reporter Eileen Wilson started gathering more and more information and the press got involved, the government said that they would release these documents. And my lawyers were able to get all of the medical records from the University of California in San Francisco associated with this experiment. And I believe they got all of the records for the 18 patients that were in this plutonium study.
You mentioned that they told your father that he had a sarcoma. Was that real? Did he actually have that, or was that just a lie that they told him to conceal what they were actually doing with injecting him with the plutonium?
Well, my mother was also my mother recalls being in some of those conferences, and in 1947, I was about 3 years old. My brother was a few months old, and even the word cancer was devastating. My mother had friends who had cancer, and when she said they have cancer, she would whisper it like it was a foreign, a bad word, a curse word. So I can imagine how afraid they were. And my mother said she was so afraid of what was going to happen because she didn't know anybody who had been diagnosed with cancer who had survived. So I'm sure my dad felt the same way. And anything that could be done to maybe reverse it or help to control it, they were going to go for it. So, but evidently my dad was misdiagnosed because with the type of bone sarcoma that he had, there was no record of anybody living more than 5 years. My dad lived from 1947 to 1991. So evidently he did not have bone cancer.
It's amazing the lengths that these so-called professionals went through and the means that they used to achieve their own ends, regardless of this life, this person, this human that was in front of them.
That is true because they traced my dad from 1947 till he died in 1991. Every year, the little doctor here in Italy, Texas, his name was Dr. A.O. Dykes. We have notes on records from UCSF. They wrote every year to find out if Elmer Allen is still alive. They would just say, "Is this man still alive?" That went on until for 25 years. Patricia Durbin, who was a scientist at Lawrence Livermore Laboratories in California, who was a former student of Oppenheimer and Hamilton, decided that she wanted to do some follow-up studies on this plutonium project and its, I'm saying, victims. She found out at the time that 4 of the people were still alive. She also asked one of the families of a person who was buried, and I can't recall the actual story, but that family allowed their family member to be disinterred so they could do tests on their bones. They convinced my mother and dad to travel to Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, New York, for what they call metabolism tests. They wrote the doctor here in Italy. They didn't write my parents directly. They wrote him and asked him if he would convince them to come. And my mother recalls a meeting with Dr. Dykes and asking his opinion. And I'm sure he didn't know any better. But he didn't see anything wrong with them going because they had convinced Dr. Dykes that my dad was some type of medical miracle who had had bone cancer and survived for 25 years. And when my parents said that they would come, my dad refused to fly. So they boarded a train in Fort Worth, Texas. And I have the itinerary, if you want a copy of that, that was sent to them by Argonne National Laboratories in Chicago. But they said, since you're coming on the train and you're going to come through Chicago, would you mind stopping at the labs here? Because we'd like to do some tests here on Elmer Allen. So when they got to Chicago, they arranged to take my mother sightseeing while they took my dad to the lab. And I have results from the tests that they took there. They knew that they saw evidence of the bones in my dad's chest cavity deteriorating at that time. They traveled on to Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, where they put my mother up in a hotel, and they told my dad he was going to be there for 2 weeks. And they told him that he could have anything that he wanted to eat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The only codicil of that was that he would have to eat that same food, the same menu every day, which we know was stabilizing his body so that they could have accurate results. His doctor there in charge of all of this was Dr. Christine Waterhouse. They collected his urine and feces every day. Records that I have show how they placed those items, the urine and feces, in mason jars, how they put them in crates and packed them so they would not break, because they were sending them back to Lawrence Livermore Labs in California. And after my dad and mother returned from that trip north, Dr. Dykes had retired, and my dad began seeing a doctor in Milford, Texas. And that's when the next chapter in this saga happened.
You mentioned something a moment ago that I do want to go back to, where you talked about your father's doctor. But first, tell us, at what point did your father realize that something was wrong, that something was off? I read in an interview and heard somewhere that he told a friend of his that he thought he was guinea pigged. At what point did he start telling people this and talking about it and saying something's not right, something's wrong here? They did something to me. At what point did that happen?
Well, from the time I can remember, my dad always said that someone had guinea pigged him. From what I understand is, after my dad's leg was amputated, and he was like free to go, and because after the injection, 3 days later, they amputated my dad's leg. They injected him with the plutonium. 3 days later, they amputated the leg. It's my feeling that my dad felt that whatever they did, whatever injection, was going to help to save his leg. And he was disappointed when it was amputated. All right? Because from the time we had to move back to Texas, I was about 6 years old. I recall my dad always not trusting doctors, not even with my daughter, when she went off to college, my dad was still telling, be careful when you go to the doctor. Don't let anybody have you sign any papers or anything like that. And be careful what you let doctors, be careful of the tests they run on you and all of this. I remember my dad being an alcoholic. I mean, it was like a weekly thing. And usually when he would speak on this subject, he would be inebriated. So the folk in my family, we came back to my mother's hometown. My mother's folk didn't have high regard for my dad. I think they really thought she married down, and down. When I say down, I mean she didn't marry anybody on her same level. And that was because my dad's alcohol problem, and he couldn't find gainful employment. We know in the South, black men in this town, it was cotton capital of Texas. As a matter of fact, in Ellis County, they produced more cotton than any other county in Texas. So this was cotton fields. My dad didn't want to come back here. My mom didn't want to come back here. But my dad had never lived here. He had grown up west of Italy. But anyway, they didn't want to come back here. And we were forced to come back, and we took over my grandmother's house. And we lived there until I graduated high school. He was never happy, but he always said, be careful what you let doctors do to you. And he would always talk about young doctors. He said that the doctors that were taking care of him at UCSF were young doctors. I know that was interns and people probably in medical school. So he didn't trust them. And then we know that a lot of the doctors were, especially Lobier, the Dr. Lobier who signed the paper that said that he would have a plutonium injection. Dr. Lobier was one of those German scientists that the United States brought here after the war to help them develop the bomb and whatever they needed to do to combat their enemies that the United States thought they had. And when you hear them speak, a lot of times you don't understand what they're saying. My dad said from day one that he knew something had been done to him, but nobody believed him. A man with a 8th grade education, African American, with a very short track record, because he'd been a Pullman porter for about 7 years. But you can read about Pullman porters, and you knew that was called gainfully employed back in that time. And he thought he had it made. My dad traveled to Chicago. He had a sister and brother that lived in Chicago, and they were making it. My aunt, which is my dad's sister that's younger than him, but closest to him, she wrote poetry, and I have a picture of my dad on one of those trips to Chicago. On their layover, they would go out to the club. They're in a club called Club de Lis, and my dad, my aunt are sitting at the table with Langston Hughes.
Really?
Yes, and I did not know that was Langston Hughes until after my dad died. We'd always had the picture, but I didn't know who he was until my aunt came. My aunt came to visit one time, and she said, "Oh, I intended to get you to make me a copy of that picture of me with Langston." And I said, "Langston who?" But it's actually Langston Hughes. I have the photo right now, and I share everything I have. I share all my pictures. I share everything, and I encourage all of us, especially African Americans, to share what we have, because our history has not been recorded, and the Anglos who run this country don't want to give us credit for anything if it's not written down. But how can it be written down when back in the day a lot of folks didn't know how to write, and Anglos were not trying to record our history? And I don't want to get off of this, but my dad had a good life before this happened to him, and had plans for his family to live in California and matriculate there, and he was devastated to have to come back home. But my mother refused to take welfare, and I have evidence of that, where when their money ran out, and she was referred to the Contra Costa County Social Services Department, and she said, "I won't do that because I can go back home, and I have relatives who will help us until we get ourselves on our feet." And that's what they did.
Your father's struggle with alcoholism, was that due to the experiment and coping with what happened to him and having his leg amputated, or was that due to something else? Was that something that was there before?
I'm sure my mother wasn't a drinker, but I'm sure my dad did social drinking, Because, like I said, the picture I have of him sitting in this nightclub, but they all dressed up. Folk went out and socialized, but he was not an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
But he headed toward I guess you would call him a lower middle class person at that time, because he had a salary from the Pullman company, and he used to always joke about how he could make more in tips than his salary, because he knew how to handle the customers that he had on his train, and they tipped him well for what he did. They went in those Pullman rooms and made their beds at night. They shined their shoes and steamed their clothes and things like that. And if you had to tell them what they wanted to hear, my dad did it because they tipped him well.
How did your mother cope with everything that was happening? How did she deal with all of this? Because I know that your father, he was devastated knowing something was happening to him and not really having anyone believe him or understand what he was going through. But what about your mother? What was she going through at that time?
Well, my mother was embarrassed. It was like, that's just making me seem like I was such a fool. Let me tell you a little bit about my mother.
Okay.
My mother grew up in Italy, Texas, the town in which I live now. She was born here. She grew up here. There was not a high school. The school only went to 10th grade. So the folk who could afford it sent their children away to go to high school. My mother was fortunate enough to have a maternal uncle and his wife who lived in Fort Worth. So after 10th grade, she moved to live with my uncle and aunt in Fort Worth, her uncle and aunt in Fort Worth, and she attended the historic I.M. Terrell High School. She was said to be a good student. And when she graduated high school, she was determined she would go to college. So she got a job. She took care of some children for Anglo family and did other things. She worked for 4 years in order to gain enough money to go to college. She put her life on hold. And she attended Tillotson College in Austin, Texas. It's now Houston Tillotson College, but in the 1940s, the 30s and 40s, it was Sam Houston College was one campus in Austin, and Tillotson College was a second campus. So she went to the Tillotson College. She graduated from college in 1942 and taught school a year. Everybody was so proud of her in the family. I mean, it was like, Fredna is our star. Mm-hmm. She had a little help from, family and when she was going to college, but it wasn't like they could afford to send her to college without her help. So that's why she worked for 4 years. After her first year of teaching, she decided she would go to California. She'd go take the train to California and visit relatives that we had there, that she had there. In El Paso, it was during the war. In El Paso, she says that the station was very crowded, and everyone was trying to get onto the train. It was like, first come, first serve. She saw a lady with a baby, and she stepped back to let the lady go before her, and they closed the gates, and they told her she had to wait. And she said she started crying. So my dad, who observed this, he was a Pullman boy at the time. He observed this, and he came over and said, young lady, can I help you? And she told him her plight and he saw how she had let somebody get through the gate before her. And they struck up a conversation, and that's how they met. It was like less than 6 months later, they were married.
Now, that story sounds like something out of a movie. That is like the ideal love story. That is an excellent story, how they met.
My mother was 27 years old
Okay.
So, and my dad was 30, in his 30s, because he was, my dad was 5 years older than my mother. So my mother was 27, my dad was 32. Mm-hmm. Neither one of them had any children. My dad had been married once before, no children, but my mother had never been married. So it was an instant connection. Mm-hmm. It was like the Cinderella story. My mother loved to tell the story. Yeah. But my mother was considered, she thought she was really smart. I mean, she was smart, but the revelation in 1991, when this was revealed that all of these things happened to my dad, my mother was devastated because she said she should have known better. She should have, with her being the more educated than my father, she should have seen the signs that it was a conspiracy and not allowed it to happen. But we know now, even in 2024, that if the government wants to do something to you, they can do it. There's nothing that you can do with that. I mean, they have ways of invading your privacy even today if you're not aware. And sometimes you can't do anything about it anyway. And that's what we tried to tell my mother when this was revealed. But she was never the same after this incident this tragedy was revealed to her. But back to how did she cope? Okay. We came back to Texas. My dad went to Goodwill Industries in Dallas, and they hired him to repair shoes. I mean, that's why he drank. I mean, it was like, he didn't want to do that. But what else could he do? With the leg amputated thigh high. He had a prosthesis that he wore, but still he couldn't do much. He did some carpentry work, and he tried to work in the fields and all of that, but he was just devastated because he had seen a different life. He said a different lifestyle. He had made it from Texas to California. He had found gainful employment. My mother had a camera, and a lot of our childhood from infancy until we came back to Texas is documented on all the pictures she took. And we knew, we had birthday parties when my mother made us cakes. We have a picture with my mother made my brother a cake that looked like a carousel with the little horses and all that on it. And my mother was gifted on creating things. My brother had a stroller. I had a tricycle, and it was like we had things that kids today have. And this was in the 1940s. We didn't have a home. We lived in an apartment, but my mother, I have a picture of my mother in a club that she belonged to. I don't know the name of the club, and I don't know if this was a club that consisted of women who were wives of Pullman porters, but I have a picture on a wall in my house right now of that group of ladies. And they were upper echelon Black folk. And they had to fall back. My mother worked in Forreston, Texas, because when we first came back here, my grandfather had passed away, but my grandmother owned a country store. It had a gas pump out front. But my dad didn't get along with my grandmother or her sister who lived down the street. And my grandmother just said, y'all can take over the store. As a matter of fact, she married again. and moved to Fort Worth and left us down here in her house with everything. It didn't work out. It didn't work out. My grandmother ended up leasing the store to someone else, and my mother got a job teaching school. She was wanted to teach. She could have taught here in Italy, but my dad acted up so. He would just drive erratic. He'd get drunk and drive erratically. I remember he ran into a railroad crossing sign. He just did that. So when my mother went to interview in Italy, they would not hire her, even though she grew up here and she knew some of the folks that were on the board. They would not hire her because of my dad's actions. But so she went to 5 miles up the highway and taught in Forreston, Texas. Eventually, she did come back to Italy to work, but it was like some years later. But she was devastated. But my mother never complained. She never blamed my dad. She was of another cut. I lived my life trying to be the opposite of my mother, so I know it affected me. Because my first husband used to tell me when I would go on to get into myself, he would say, "I'm not your dad," because I did not like my dad. I did not like him at all, and when he died, I did not like him. I did not understand what happened until after this was revealed, and I started doing research. And I feel really bad about how I treated my dad because I did not understand. I did not like my dad because the only thing I remember is how difficult he made my mother's life. Now I know he was struggling because nobody believed what he was saying. His alcoholism was based on the fact that nobody believed that he knew that he had been harmed in some way, and his ability to function was taken away when they amputated his leg. He knew that he had been wrong. He said he would never go to a young doctor because he said when this happened, the doctors were running in and out of his room. But when you think about it, plutonium was something that they all knew was harmful. Plutonium was what they put into the atomic bomb. And to see that injected into a person, I'm sure those interns were very excited. And that probably made my dad know that something was up. Something was happening that was different or strange. And he said those young doctors didn't know what they were doing. And later on, when Eileen came here after my dad died to get information for her book, for her series at the Albuquerque Tribune newspaper, and eventually her book, she talked to one of my dad's friends. And we never knew that my dad talked to anybody about it, but he told our neighbor, his name was Mr. Joe Speed. He said, they guinea pigged me. And we know what they do to guinea pigs, so.
So your father's friend, was this the only person that he would confide in about his thoughts about what may have been happening to him with the experiment?
He tried to tell everybody in the family, but they was going, Al is crazy. Nobody's done anything to him. It's like nobody believed him. His story was so bizarre that nobody believed him. When Daddy would start talking, because let me tell you, when your leg is amputated, I found this out, that's why you can wear prosthesis, because it still feels like it's there. Okay? Daddy would sit, sometimes he would be sitting at the table and his stump would actually move up and down. You could see it move. And he would say, "Oh, they working on that leg right now." I'm going, what? So, I'm looking at a document right now that I have in front of me here that says that It describes how this all took place. Right after they injected him with the plutonium, injected it into his calf. Three days later, they took him to surgery. It says a tourniquet was wrapped around the upper thigh. Then the skin and underlying muscles were peeled back and severed. The nerves and arteries were isolated and snipped off. A saw was used to cut through the thigh bone. Following the amputation, Elmer was wheeled out of the operating room in good condition and given morphine, codeine, and aspirin to relieve the pain. The severed limb was sent to pathology and radiological study. There is evidence that bone on my dad's leg still exists in a lab up in the state of Washington. So when my dad would say they working on that leg, it wasn't alive. They might have been doing some studies on that bone. This is what I believe now.
You know, there's no telling what else they could have been using besides plutonium with your father's leg, you know, and what they could actually still be doing today and what they've done over the years.
Scientists have said that if my dad's body is exhumed 10,000 years from now, there will still be evidence in his body of plutonium. 10,000 years. It's an alpha product. It goes inward and it stays there.
Has the government approached you about exhuming your father's body to do more testing? Have they tried to do anything like that?
No, we haven't. And my brother had his, even before he knew about it, this is when my dad was when he died, my brother made sure he went into a steel vault. And then after we heard about this, my brother had concrete put over the grave and granite laid on top of the concrete. So, and have you seen my dad's headstone?
I haven't seen it.
Okay. I'll give you a link so you can go and get a copy of that online, because it's online.
Okay.
It has my brother designed it because it is our contention that my dad Elmer Allen actually died on the day that his leg was amputated. And after that, he became a product of the United States government because, you know, they didn't call him Elmer in any of the papers. They called him CAL-3, which meant that he was the third person injected with plutonium at University of California Hospital.
Now, your father's friend, his best friend, that he would talk to about the experiment and what he thought, did he believe your father, or did he say anything about it? What were his thoughts? We didn't
know anything about it until Eileen approached him when she was writing for her book. He's passed away right now. He's passed away, but he said that my dad had told him that he believed that he had been used as a guinea pig.
Now, I want to go back to the doctor, your father's doctor. And I know that your father confided in this doctor about what he thought about what was going on with the experiment. And what did the doctor have to say? What was his role in all of this?
Well, I don't know if whatever he what he ever said to Dr. Dykes, the doctor here in Italy. But that doctor's name, but I have after the 25-year study at Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, it was made known to a congressional committee. This was even before, this was 1970, maybe 75, 76. You can find it in the, most of everything that I'm saying can be found in Eileen Wellsman's book, The Plutonium Files. It is the most comprehensive story of all of this. It's in this book called The Plutonium Files. But in 1976, somebody in Congress or in the Energy Department let it be known to Congressman Edward Markey. And Markey, I believe, is a senator, if he's not retired, a senator from Massachusetts. Now, he was a congressman. And he knows a lot about this study. He brought it forth to his fellow congressman on the energy, on this energy committee. It wasn't called the Department of Energy back in the day. It was called something else. But he was assigned to this panel. And they discussed it. I have documentation somewhere in these 36 boxes that surround me. It's where they discussed it in Washington, D.C. And it was said that someone needed to inform the victims of this tragedy that they had been injected. Especially, they needed to find the 4 people who were still alive. They needed to not find them, go to them, because they knew who they were, because they had all been called to Rochester for metabolism tests. They needed to go and tell them that they had been injected with plutonium. Well, in my dad's case, let's see if I can find the names of those folks. Got so many documents. But, they came to give me a second. I'm trying to find these doctors' names. They were ordered to come and tell the victims that they had been injected with plutonium. They came to South Ellis County, Texas, but they came and observed where my parents lived. But they decided they would go and tell his doctor, which that was his second doctor that he'd had here in Texas. They'd go and tell him. Now, this man was not even a medical, well, he was not an MD. I think he was a DO. And they went to tell him, and the conversation that they had, that they recorded when they got back and wrote down their findings, was like the doctor thought it was a joke, and they told him to tell my dad. I know he didn't tell my dad. If it was a joke when the scientists were talking to the doctors, then it was a joke when the man talked to my dad. But I know that my dad went to his grave not knowing what actually happened to him. After my dad changed doctors, he went up to the county seat to Waxahachie, and he was being seen by a doctor called David Williams, a very highly regarded doctor in our county. And my doctor tried to tell him that something had happened to him. And I believe he tried to tell him what the previous doctor had told him. But Dr. Williams himself said he did not know whether he would believe my dad or not. He didn't believe Elmer. And for some reason, he thought my daddy was paranoid. And my dad had had seizures for as long as I could remember. So his records from Dr. Williams says that he was a paranoid schizophrenic. And that's what's most hurting about it, because he was given Dilantin and that really strong medication to combat the schizophrenia. And I know it had to have affected his last years. Dr. Williams said that my dad was an emotional cripple because he had lost his limb, and it was all because he never accepted the fact that he lost his limb, and he was paranoid.
Now, is this the same doctor that was in communication with the Department of Energy and sharing your father's medical records and charts with them, feeding them that information?
Well, like I said, every year for the first 25 years, the letter came from University of California, San Francisco Hospital to Dr. Dykes in Italy. And they asked the only thing they asked was he's still alive and how his health was. It was like 1, 2, 3 questions. But in Dr. Williams' file, we found, after my dad died, we found a letter from Argonne National Laboratories in Chicago, which said, if this man should become terminal at any time, please call this particular number. And I can send you a copy of this. It said, call this number because we'll be interested in knowing this. And we know that they wanted to know that so that they could try to retrieve his body parts. And I will share that. If you want a copy of that letter, I can send that to you as well.
Yes, please do share that information. I would love to have that. You know, it's amazing because, you know, it's one thing to hear interviews and to read articles and different books about these experiments, but to hear you talk about it and give your account of what you actually saw, actually being there with your father to see what he experienced, and to hear you tell it, you know, in the way that you do, you tell it so well, that really drives everything home and helps me to understand and appreciate what he was going through, because I can relate to it, you know, through my own story. So this gives me a fuller picture of what actually happened with your dad.
That is why I'm so happy that you're sharing your story. That is why I didn't ask you. You know, I didn't ask you a lot of questions. I didn't quiz you on a lot of your background. I believe you. I believe what you're saying simply because nobody believed my dad. And going through our history, my history of my family, our history as African Americans, I know that we need to share more of our experiences. I don't know if you're much younger than I, probably young enough to be my child, but I know during my lifetime, and your mother might tell you this, but our parents did not share a lot of the hardships with us. They protected us. They did not want us to know what they had been through. But as I do research, when I find things that happen to people who are older than I, it is my responsibility to expose the demons in those acts, because it's very important that we know it. They didn't complain, but it's up to us to not forget what happened. That's what bothers me, is that our young people don't know, and many of them don't want to know. But if there's just one life, one person who will carry the story on to the next generation, I want them to know the truth. And I have several people, not necessarily my family members, but I have one or two people who have vowed that they are going to carry this on once I die. And that makes me very proud that I'm doing what I do now.
And that's exactly how it should be, because these are the lesser known struggles that we as a people have had to endure. You know, we know about slavery, we know about the lynchings, you know, we know about the civil rights movement. They broadcast those every chance they get, you know. But it's the lesser known evils like these experiments that, like your father had to go through, and the Holmesburg prison experiment and the Tuskegee experiment. It's those lesser known evils that we really need to put out there and educate people on, so that we don't keep repeating these same mistakes like they're doing now. You know, before my experience started happening a few years ago, you know, I had never even heard about the plutonium experiments. You know, I'd never heard of your father. I'd never heard of these things. And even with the Tuskegee experiment, there was a lot of things that I just didn't know. You know, the extent of my knowledge on the Tuskegee experiment was from the movie Miss Evers' Boys.
I've seen that several times.
You know, and I used to love that movie, and I watched it, and, you know, it gives you a certain perspective where it makes you kind of sympathetic towards the experimenters as well as the victims of the experiment. And they didn't really portray them as evil. You know, you knew what they were doing was wrong, but they didn't portray them as evil. And it wasn't until I learned the extent of the experiment and the lies that were told and the dirty, underhanded things that were that they did to make that happen, in addition to doing the same experiment in Guatemala around the same time, which was relatively worse. You know, until then, there was just a lot I didn't know. So these are things that we really need to know. And this is part of history that really needs to be broadcast and put out there.
I encourage you to see the movie Oppenheimer. Mm-hmm. This is what I feel the scientists believe, and they did believe this, because when we found out about this experiment, it had been documented in medical journals for years. The doctors and scientists had been reading about this, but nobody came forward and said, are any of these people alive? Should we find them and try to see if we could give them some assistance? The scientists feel that it's okay, it's acceptable to sacrifice a few for the benefit of many. Mm-hmm. And that was what this plutonium experiment was about. They had the bomb. The United States had the bomb. They were making more of the bombs to put in arsenals for our quote-unquote defense. Folk were working in the factories handling this toxic chemical. There was no way to get any data unless they had some test subjects to actually put this plutonium into their bodies and then test them to see how it affected them. and they determined, the folk in the factories, maybe you would work 3 weeks and then you take off a week, because the only way you can excrete it from your body is through your urine and feces. So you needed to be out of the environment for 1 week out of the month. Then you could come back to work. It was still affecting them, but they figured they would last longer if they took some time off and let the plutonium escape, because it goes straight in, and the only way you can excrete it is through your urine and feces. But you can never, we know now, you can never excrete all of it.
So you not only have the test subjects who were affected, but you also have the workers, the people who were handling the plutonium, who were most likely having issues as well that we don't know about.
I'm sure they did. I don't think there was ever a study done on the people who worked in the factories. I've never seen anything that said anything about that, because I guess they were breathing it in or touching it, and maybe it was going through their pores. But the folks that were in this experiment were actually injected with plutonium, with a syringe, went into their muscles.
Your father passed away in 1991, which is the same year I graduated high school. And it was a couple of years after that Eileen contacted you about the experiment?
We found out exactly 1 year later. It was July of 1992 when we found out that when Eileen called, you know her story, right? And she had, Eileen had come across a sentence in one of the documents that said that Elmer Allen's doctor in Italy, Texas, had been contacted. So she said to herself, Italy, Texas, it's got to be a little town. So she said she picked up the phone and she called the Italy City Hall. She didn't know my dad's name, but she knew he was African American. She knew his age. She knew his left leg had been amputated. So she said, I'm looking for a man. I don't know his name, but he's African American. He should be about 80 years old. And his left leg is amputated. And she said the lady stopped her in mid-sentence. And she said, I know who that is. That's Elmer Allen. He died last year. But do you want his wife's telephone number? And that it happened just like that. That she had contact with my mother. But she said she'd handled those papers for 4 or 5 years before that sentence popped after her. That would be her key to trying to find out the names of the victims of the Manhattan Project. And she actually said that Elmer Allen was the first name that she found. And after that, she was able to find the names of the other 17.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your knowledge and the information you've given, and for keeping your father's memory alive and sharing his story to the masses. And thank you for all that you do for the town of Italy, Texas, for the state of Texas, for the United States, for your people, and for your family.
Again, Mr. Nesbitt, I appreciate being here today. If there's anything I can help you with in the future, please don't hesitate to contact me. Continue with your will to live.
Well, this concludes our episode for today. I want to extend a special thanks to Miss Elmerine Allen Whitfield Bell. Be sure to stay tuned for the next episode coming soon. And please remember to go and sign and share my petition at change.org. That link is change.org/will-to-live. Join me at Twitter and Instagram at will-to-live-us. You can join me on TikTok at Devil in the Details Podcast. Also, you can listen to the podcast on Spotify and YouTube. You can find the Devil in the Details podcast there at Will to Live US is the name for both of those. Or you can search for Devil in the Details podcast. And also coming soon to Patreon. I'm going to be on there pretty soon and get ready for that. So please subscribe to all of those and share all of the social media sites and my petition and my podcast. Definitely share this episode with your family and friends and, discuss it, talk about it. And hopefully you will join us again for our next episode. And I really appreciate your time. And that is all for today. Take care.